inside each one of us, a story is waiting to be told. A story of sex, adventure, and survival. It begins in Africa with the dawn of humanity. Careens through epic droughts and ice ages, and climaxes only when we've reached the ends of the earth. Now, we tell this story with a bold experiment. On a single day, on a single street, with the DNA of just a handful of people, we set out to trace the ancient journeys of every person alive today. And reveal how we all connect on the human family tree. Quintessential melting pot. Huddled masses from all over the globe have come here for centuries in search of a better life. And up the East River, just across from Manhattan, we find they've never stopped coming. This is one of the most diverse spots on Earth. Queens, New York, USA. People are flocking to the 30th Avenue Street Fair here in Queens' Astoria district, where geneticist Spencer Wells and his team are on a mission.
Just on one side, it's fine.
They're scraping DNA off the cheeks of this kaleidoscope of people and attempting to retrace humanity's journey to all corners of the earth on this single street.
Scrape up and down. All that information, that's it.
This place is really a microcosm of the world. You got people from all over the planet just walking around on this one street. I mean, today we've been talking to people from Bangladesh, people from Thailand, people from Pakistan, Ecuador, all over the Afro-Caribbean region. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity.
And so it's pretty hard, but certainly don't want to draw the line.
Swabbing here today is part of a much larger effort by National Geographic and IBM called the Genographic Project. The project has spent the last 4 years collecting DNA from 350,000 people around the world.
Honey, do you wish you've changed in the morning?
It is basically a quest to understand, where we all came from. That's one of those key human questions that everybody is kind of searching for the answer to. Who am I? Who are my ancestors? And we're using the tools of science to get the answers to that.
Oh, I like that.
Because when I was born, my mother told me I had like some blonde hair on my back. I don't know where that came from. It's not there now.
Now, hundreds of New Yorkers are lining up to get these questions answered too, and learn about their own ancient pasts.
I think we were looking for something unexpected, so we sort of know where we're from, but, we don't really know where we're from.
He's very excited about it, and he thinks that he's gonna change his life.
Genealogy allows most of us to trace our ancestors back about 4 or 5 generations, to great-great-grandparents perhaps.
And probably we can go as far as probably 100 years.
This is your deep ancestry, so we're not necessarily looking at your grandparents.
If we're lucky, we know where these ancestors lived.
My mom's from South Korea, and on my father's side, I am German, Irish, English, and I think a little bit of Native American, but that part I'm not sure.
So what do you know about your ancestry?
New York, that's about it.
These DNA tests tell a deeper story. Rather than taking us back just a handful of generations, they take us back many thousands.
Did cheek swab is basically a way of getting at the DNA history book that we're carrying inside of ourselves. All of that information has to be copied in every generation to pass on to kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. So we're carrying this continuous kind of genetic historic document that goes back through the generations since, tens, hundreds, thousands of years ago.
No matter where we're from, how different we appear, if we look back through the generations at the roots of the human family tree, we find we are all related. We descend from a small group of Homo sapiens who began eking out a living in Africa around 200,000 years ago. People didn't leave Africa until much later, when hard times or greener pastures led them out. Ultimately, they gave rise to this bunch of New Yorkers.
Their ancestors' lineages have been diverging and going off on different paths around the globe. And now they've come back together in Queens, but they started off together.
Wonderful, wonderful, big smile. Beautiful, beautiful.
By cracking open the DNA of just a handful of random New Yorkers, as they discover their own personal histories, we discover how humans populated the entire world.
That's wonderful.
An expectant mother, Carrie Nicholson Gonzalez, shows how we made it to Europe.
It would be really fun to find out how we're different, but we're not.
Oh, beautiful.
Gringrai Tongchitsamran, a chef from Thailand, transports us to the settling of Asia.
My grandmother, she would say that, her ancestors probably originally from China forever. They just come from the ground in China somewhere.
A fashion model, Dave Reed, brings us back to our roots in Africa, in places he'd never imagined.
I would assume that my family did come over at some point in time as slaves, but no one really knows any details. That one slot was probably one of the only ways that I'll find out anything about my ancestors.
Yes, there you go.
And Michelle De Jesus, a fourth grade teacher, connects us to the first Americans.
I don't think any of us really expect there's anything left in our blood that would trace us back to our indigenous heritage. It would be really interesting to see if that was even possible.
Our ancient connections may not be obvious to this group. Our ancestors adapted to different climates, and as a result, humans are now among the most physically varied looking species on the planet. But looks can be deceiving.
We're basically identical at the genetic level. I mean, if you look at the average person's DNA sequence and compare the same region to another person they're unrelated to, they're 99.9% identical.
All that? There. Look right here. This is great.
Light, dark, big, small, curly, straight, brown, blue. Minuscule genetic changes account for all of our differences. To track our ancient paths, though, scientists study DNA that stays very much the same. In men like George Dellis, it's a Y chromosome.
All that? Let's do one more.
It's been passed down the line from father to son over thousands of generations, and ultimately traces back to one man who lived in Africa around 60,000 years ago. Call him Scientific Adam. He wasn't the only guy alive back then, but only his Y chromosome survived through the ages, and every man alive today has a copy.
Really pushing in there.
For women like Nejla Demirci, the DNA comes from special cell structures called mitochondria, which both men and women carry, but only moms pass along. These trace back to one woman who also lived in Africa between 150 to 200,000 years ago. Call her Scientific Eve. She is the oldest root of our family tree. Africa is where the journey begins for everyone alive today.
No words.
To think that we could all start from one point of origin and then be so completely diverse, like thousands, hundreds, and thousands, millions of years later. It's kind of wild.
I can believe that the people come from Africa. We are from Bangladesh. This is very exciting.
A lot of people know their mother's path or their father's father.
It's only the first surprise for our New Yorkers. The Genographic team will soon reassemble these people and reveal their unique genetic results. With a little luck, they've got the right mix of DNA to take us all back to our beginnings in Africa and plot our many amazing journeys out.
We're not going to pick up every single lineage in the world, but we're probably going to pick up the major lineages here. Hopefully we'll find something new and unexpected. But basically, yeah, I think we've got the story covered, just right here at the street fair.
It's an epic saga of twists and turns. And it begins where life begins. She doesn't know it yet, but Carrie Nicholson Gonzalez has just passed along to her newborn baby Leo what other moms have for tens of thousands of years. Genetic markers that link her son to the birth of us all. Like so many others who call this place home, Carrie isn't a native New Yorker. Third-generation American, born and raised in Ohio, she left a small town in the American Midwest for life in the big city.
I moved to New York in the summer of 2000 to pursue dance and life and see what happens.
Life happened. Carrie now dances professionally for a modern dance troupe, teaches Pilates. She met a guy, got married, started a family here. Yet, as is the case for many trying to build a life in a strange new home, Carrie still clings tightly to her old one.
This is my Grandma Josephine and my Grandpa John, and this is a picture from their wedding, and they just got married after the war in 1945, and very handsome couple, I think.
Photographs and records date back to Carrie's European roots in Slovenia, more than 100 years ago.
They're pretty priceless. This is what has come to make my life. And all of these people, if they didn't all come together, then I wouldn't be here.
Good.
While Carrie can trace back about 3 generations to a faraway land, her DNA can take her back more than 6,000 generations, across many lands, to her most ancient of grandmothers, Scientific Eve. There were many of us back then, living somewhere between Eastern and Southern Africa. Eve and this small band of people set the stage for us all, one baby at a time. Despite all the babies that have come between Eve and Carrie, their DNA is still 99.9% similar. To trace our ancestries, scientists have to pour through the 0.1% that's different, through tiny, random changes to the A's, C's, G's, and T's that accumulate in our genetic codes over time. Scientists call them markers.
A marker is a glimpse of a person who lived at some point in the distant past. If you share a marker with someone, you share an ancestor, the person who first had that change in their DNA, and they don't change the way you look or give you a disease or make you better than anyone else. They're just baggage that gets passed on through the generations.
200,000 years ago, the DNA in scientific Eve's mitochondria picked up some of these random changes. An A became a G. Some T's became C's. She unknowingly passed those changes along to her daughters. And her daughters, onto her daughters, down the line over thousands of daughters, to Carrie and every other person on the planet.
My great-grandparents were Ivan and Anna Mukovic. When they came to the States, they changed their name to Mukovitz. So they thought it was easier, Americanized.
Just like a family tree, markers allow us to connect people through history. Since they crop up at a fairly steady rate, markers also serve as a kind of clock to estimate when people lived. And by looking at how markers cluster, they can even act as roadmaps to show us where our ancestors came from and where they moved. Scientists call these different lines of descent haplogroups, and there are hundreds of them. Taken together, they give us a timeline of human migration.
So in Carrie's case, she's a member of haplogroup J. I actually belong to the same genetic lineage. I'm a J too.
J is a relatively recent marker found commonly in Europe, the end of the road for Carrie's ancestors. A little further back in time, we find the J connects to the R in the Middle East. And before that, and ultimately all the way back to Africa, the one place on Earth where all of our DNA converges.
There is far more diversity in Africa than there is outside of Africa. And because we accumulate this diversity, these genetic changes, or markers as we call them, in a clock-like fashion, that means that Africans have been accumulating diversity for longer. Therefore, our species originated here.
And according to our DNA clocks, before taking a single step out of Africa, we stayed there for a long time. As much as 3/4 of our history as a species, some 140,000 years. Back then, as now, people didn't typically move without a reason. And climate models indicate that life in Africa would have been pretty good for Eve and many of her descendants. Lush savannas and grasslands covered much of the continent for tens of thousands of years. But we know people didn't stay in Africa forever. To find out what may have ultimately forced us out, scientists compare the DNA of people who left Africa with those who never did. Indigenous groups, like the San Bushmen of southern Africa. San are universally accepted to be the world's oldest genetically distinct population of humans. Even if nowadays their cultural links to the past are mostly for the sake of tourists. Their markers connect them to scientific Eve, but split off from the rest of humanity soon after. Recently, the Genographic Project used DNA from the San to help pinpoint some of our earliest movements in Africa. This time, they compared the genes of the San with other African groups, like those who lived about 1,500 miles north of the San near Tanzania's Serengeti. Hadzabe.
They are one of the last groups of hunter-gatherers on Earth, essentially using fairly primitive technology to survive. And that's the way we lived for most of our history.
The Hadzabe, like the San, connect back to scientific Eve. But by studying the differences in their DNA, scientists revealed that by around 150,000 years ago, our family population had split in two. It is the first branch on our family tree. The earliest major movement of people our genes have measured. One group became the ancestors of the San, the other the ancestors of the Hadzabe and other African groups, and ultimately, the entire rest of the world.
The lineages that define the San versus the Hadzabe only join up right near the base. Okay, basically back at the root of the tree. And that is because the San were isolated from the main line of human evolution for about 100,000 years.
No one knows exactly what led to this split, but all signs point to climate. Slight changes in Earth's orbit ushered in a new ice age, and climate shifted for 100,000 years. In the northern hemisphere, that meant ice and cold. But in Africa, things became blisteringly dry. Sometime after scientific Eve, about 130,000 years ago, our lush cradle of humanity transformed into desert. There was no rain for thousands of years. Many scientists believe massive deserts not only drove a wedge between the ancestors of the San and the Hadzabe, they almost wiped them off the face of the earth. Clive Finlayson is an evolutionary biologist and ecologist.
These kinds of shifts would have made a difference. It would have isolated populations. It could have shut shop and made them, really suffer quite hard, big hardships. So climate, in that sense, has been central to everything.
This period lasted thousands of years, and geneticists say it was the bleakest in our history. Huddled around shrinking sources of water, our ancestors were hanging on by a thread. No one knows how big the initial human population was, but based on the lack of genetic variation during the mega-drought years, the number dropped to as few as 2,000 people. We were an endangered species.
If you take that at face value, our species is hanging on by its fingernails. We were on the verge of extinction.
The state of Nebraska is locked in one of its worst dry spells in decades as high temperatures and dry conditions shrivel crops and have
somehow these people made it through the population crunch.
Few years, however,
if they hadn't, Kerry wouldn't be here, nor the rest of us for that matter.
Warnings suggested that farmers plant drought-resistant crops and offered tips about how to keep fields as moist as possible.
Kerry's cousins, some 5,000 generations removed, the Hadzabes, may offer some insight into how we hung on. Wells has been working with Chief Julius Ndaya to record the Hadzabe's ancient survival strategies, while helping to preserve them for future generations.
You are taking branching, Udani. You are crushed. And then you are going there for 3 times per day, and then 2 days, coffee is gone.
Julius can read the forest, the savanna that we're walking through as though it's a book. It's like walking through a library with him, and he'll pull a volume from the shelf, and he'll fan it to page 45 and read some passage to you.
See, with the poison, very poisonous. But the roots is a very nice medicine for stomach.
That's fine.
Accumulated knowledge, advanced tools, language. Many scientists believe our ancestors began developing these skills during that time when our species was on the brink.
It wasn't until we went through that climate crunch that you really needed those skills in order to survive.
It was survival of the fittest. Climate change may have actually made us tougher and smarter. Around 70,000 years ago, climate studies indicate the drought in Africa lets up for a time. Archaeological evidence reveals tools cropping up all across the continent, and the genetics show new lineages taking root. The human population was growing again, and it never stopped. We haven't shared any of this with Carrie yet, just whetted her appetite for her results.
It's kind of sparked this desire to really go back and try to understand who was who and how you were related, especially now that Leo's here. There's a lot more to know than just the few steps back that we know and that we have pictures for.
Carrie's ancient ancestors would soon take some steps that changed the world forever. They left Africa behind. In a Thai restaurant in Queens, in the DNA of a waitress and a chef, we find clues about the people who take those first fateful steps out of Africa.
Vegetable. Okay. And?
Tao Sudi and Gringrai Tangshitsamran share similar ethnic backgrounds. Both trace their recent ancestry to China and Thailand. Both came to New York and left family behind.
That's my great-grandmother. This is my grandmother and my grandfather. I talk to them all the time, how's grandma doing? And she always like, oh, you save money, you come back to Thailand, you open a business.
But Gringrai and Tao's ancient lineages are very different. Gringrai ultimately shows us how people spread from Africa all across Asia. But only Tao, who was too modest to talk to us on camera, has markers tracing back to those very first people who left. Her marker, known as M-Star, is found throughout Asia, as well as in indigenous groups on islands in the Pacific and Australia. We don't know a lot about why Tao's ancestors left Africa, let alone how they populated islands in the Pacific Ocean. Harsh climate may have sent them searching for greener pastures. A booming population may have made resources scarce. Or perhaps it was just the opposite.
If they're doing very well in that kind of environment, and that environment suddenly spreads because of the climate change, then it's the driving pump that gets them moving and gets them spreading to other parts of the planet.
Until recently, most scientists believe people took a northern route out of Africa, across the Sinai into the Middle East. But since that required crossing the Sahara Desert, many are now looking further south. At the southern tip of the Red Sea, Africa is a mere 17 miles from the Arabian Peninsula. It's unclear if people would have seen the other side back then, but birds, dust, perhaps a forest fire would have signaled that something was out there. They may have walked, swam, or rafted, but around 60,000 years ago, the genetics indicate they left. Once they reached the Arabian Peninsula, there was nothing to get in their way. Skillful fishermen, they found a limitless supply of seafood for thousands of miles. They journeyed along the coasts of Iran and Pakistan, down and around India, all the way into Southeast Asia. Tao's ancestors made it to Thailand by around 50,000 years ago. But while many with her marker chose to stay put there, climate at the time allowed many more to venture further. Today, miles of ocean separate mainland Asia from the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Borneo. But during the Ice Age, when vast amounts of our oceans were frozen at the poles, Earth was a very different place. In the warm tropics, sea levels were around 300 feet lower. As a result, what are islands today were linked up back then. One continuous landmass connected Asia with southern Indonesia, just north of Australia. People could walk all the way to Java without getting their feet wet. But the story doesn't end there. Some of Tao's ancestors stayed in Southeast Asia, but their markers are found as far away as Australia, in people like the Aborigines. To reach there, even with the lower sea levels at the time, they still had to contend with some 45 miles open water.
The big question is, how do they do it?
They may have been out fishing in craft, and currents would have taken them away, or it could have been deliberate. And if they were under pressure where they were, other peoples or shortage of food, they may have tried it. They may have taken the risk, taken the gamble, and gone for it.
And whether they set out to reach a new continent or drifted to it, around 45,000 years ago, modern humans landed in Australia. While it's tempting to think of these epic journeys as deliberate migrations, this was likely not the case. Our ancestors didn't exactly have Australia in mind when they left Africa. Life was all about more immediate opportunities.
Is one generation after another is moving into different areas because of demographic pressure within. At the end of the day, what you're after is food. And that is really what's driving this, not a sort of migration. The guy that left the Horn of Africa didn't find Australia. He was probably the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of that person, or daughter, that eventually got to Australia.
People likely moved no more than a few miles up the beach from their parents back then. But over generations, those miles added up. And even at the rate of just 1 mile a year, people could get from Africa to Australia in less than 10,000 years. Unfortunately, if any evidence of early human settlements were left behind, they're underwater now. Submerged thousands of years later when the Ice Age receded, glaciers melted, and sea levels rose. The little evidence we do have indicates Tao's ancestors may not have been the first to take this trek. Some people may have reached Asia thousands of years sooner. For that story, we rewind to the rainforests of Sumatra, 74,000 years ago. Mount Toba erupts with a force greater than 1 billion tons of TNT. It's the largest explosion on Earth in the last 2 million years. Thousands of tons of ash spew into the atmosphere and block out the sun for up to a decade. Ash from the eruption blankets areas nearly 3,000 miles from Toba. And while genetics tells us people hadn't left Africa at the time, today in India, archaeologists are digging up a very different picture. In the very ash that fell during the explosion. It places humans directly in Toba's path. Toba's ash remains a precious commodity in Jawalaparam, India. Local villagers mine it for things like polishes and abrasives. To Cambridge University's Michael Petraglia and Ravi Korisethar of Karnataka University, it's an invaluable line in the sand. They believe it holds proof that people were already living far from Africa 74,000 years ago, when Toba blew its top.
We're looking at the passage of time, and so this goes back many, many thousands of years, and then right here we have the Toba ash, which dates to 74,000 years ago.
Any tools found below the ash were left there prior to the eruption. Anything above was left after. These scientists are finding tools before and after.
Which means to us that these human groups survived through the Toba super eruption.
The find is controversial. The tools could have belonged to Homo erectus or Neanderthals who ventured into Asia hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But this team argues they look too much like modern human tools found elsewhere.
The point we're trying to demonstrate here is that an object like this, found in Africa, made by modern humans, is very similar to the object we find here in this site in India.
The evidence convinces Petraglia that modern humans were already in India at least 14,000 years before Tao's ancestors left Africa.
And it's like a toothbrush, okay? And you use it to scrape the cells from the inside of your cheeks.
And the dates may not be contradictory.
Geneticists are taking their samples off of living populations, and we think we have evidence that geneticists can't possibly be picking up in living populations today.
If people did exit Africa before the Toba eruption, they may well have died off sometime after. Or perhaps, when people like Tao's ancestors finally did reach India, the groups mingled, and ultimately only Tao's genes survived.
It's like, most wars, the story is written by the winners and not by the vanquished. And there must have been a lot of populations that never made it to tell the story.
the mountains of the Philippines, we find living proof of how fragile genetic lineages can be. Geneticist Spencer Wells and his colleagues are distributing genetic results to an indigenous group here called the Aita.
Okay, everyone, if you could come gather around here.
Small-statured, curly-haired, dark-skinned people who number only about 20,000 strong.
We've always lived here, and that there are the people with the curly hair and the people with the straight hair.
Sinasabi daw po niya,
So the oldest genetic lineages that we found in you, in the Aita people, tell the story of the settlement of the Philippines.
ang tao ninyo.
Much of the Aita's ancient DNA has been diluted through the ages, and scientists are still hashing out the details. But it appears their ancestors took that same coastal migration out of Africa that Taos did. They walked to these islands back when sea levels were low. And when the Ice Age began waning about 11,000 years ago, they got cut off from the rest of the world. Since the tropical climate wouldn't have been much different than Africa's, their African features hardly changed. Taos, on the other hand, obviously did. And it turns out, Gringrai's ancestors were responsible. They moved eastward out of Africa sometime later than Taos did, following a much colder inland route. They lived in isolation somewhere around China for thousands of years, where they likely adapted to the frigid Ice Age climate, before heading south and mingling with Tao's ancestors. No one knows for sure why Asian or any other physical feature took shape back then. Short stature may have helped conserve heat. Flatter noses may have protected against frostbite. An extra skin flap over the eyes, called an epicanthic fold, might have cut down on glare in the snow. Today, we find these adaptations all over Asia, like in the Philippines' capital, Manila.
It's possible that it could happen within a few thousand years, within a few dozen generations perhaps. Just a few genetic changes can result in massive changes in your surface features.
Once climate provided the initial spark for some of these physical adaptations, more superficial causes may have helped them reproduce.
A lot of that probably had to do with the forced Darwin called sexual selection. We mate with people we find attractive, and that varies according to where you are in the world. So probably the first people to settle Southeast Asia found this particular set of features attractive.
My grandparents are in Thailand now. They have 11 children. That's how big our family is. So it's everywhere.
Around 40,000 years ago, Gringrai's ancient family was also quite prolific, ultimately swapping DNA with Tao's. While Tao's ancestors kept the M-star marker, they lost their African appearances. It's a mix-and-match game people have been playing since their earliest days in Africa, and would continue to play everywhere they went. This will all come as a shock to Gringrai. He'll soon learn that as far as his maternal ancestry is concerned, he has less DNA in common with Tao than he does with our next New Yorker, an immigrant from Turkey. Necla Demirci and her husband Mehmet came to New York from Turkey about 3 years ago, in part to get a taste of the world's diversity. Here you go.
Good. Yeah. Turks, you have Eastern Europeans, you have Hispanics, you have Turkish, you have Arabic. I like that very much. Can we have Bulgarian, sound of Bulgarian?
Necla says her family has been living in Turkey, or perhaps neighboring Georgia, for as long as anyone can remember. Her DNA, of course, traces all the way back to Africa and Scientific Eve. But unlike Tau's M-star marker, which is found mainly along the southern coast of Asia, Necla's N marker points to others who didn't leave Africa until about 10,000 years after Tau's, about 50,000 years ago. Around that time, the ice age that froze over Europe, drained the oceans, and parched Africa took a temporary breather. Ice sheets melted, releasing moisture back into the atmosphere and turned much of Africa green. Necla's ancestors were able to call a lush Sahara home.
What you have are lots of savanna environments in the image of a Serengeti or a Masai Mara today. These are great places for people to live. And if you get periods when the desert becomes wetter and becomes savanna, then these populations just are pulsing out and spreading across.
With water and food plentiful, populations in Africa continued to expand. People could follow grasslands farther and farther into northern Africa than they ever could before. Perhaps following the Nile into what is now Sudan and Egypt. And eventually, across the Sinai into Eurasia. It was the second major wave of humans out of Africa. And one of Necla's ancestors, along with most everyone else's who live outside Africa, wrote it. In the scorching heat of today's Sahara Desert, in central Chad, the geographic team is uncovering some surprising new facets of this migration.
D'origine très diverse. La population.
These are the Tubu, herders and nomads who've occupied this region for some 30,000 years. They may have been the first people to inhabit the Sahara.
How does he feel about the possibility that the samples we just took will tell us perhaps whether they are the first inhabitants?
Nous le saurons bien, puisque ça, les recherches scientifiques qui vont définir, puisque tout ce qu'on dit là, c'est la science qui peut mettre en exergue.
From the looks of them, the Tubu could have originated anywhere on this continent. But from their Y chromosomes, Wells is learning their immediate ancestors aren't African, but Middle Eastern. Their DNA indicates our route out of Africa was a two-way street.
The Tubu give us an insight, I suppose, into why people move. And it's not that people were jettisoning Africa during this exodus as they moved up into the Middle East. See you later, we're not going to come back. They were simply following the grasslands, following opportunities. And when the opportunities opened up again, back in the Sahara, back in North Africa, some of them decided to turn around and go back.
The sweltering, dry Sahara reclaimed the grasslands many thousands of years ago. And yet, somehow, despite whipping sands, blistering winds, and routine temperatures upwards of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Tubu seem to feel right at home.
These incredible people, the Tubu, have adapted to this very harsh environment, and they not only survive, but seem to thrive there in a place that most of us couldn't contemplate living in.
The conditions in New York might be somewhat less extreme, but like her Tubu cousins, Necla Demirci continues to adapt to her new home too, by bringing a little bit of her old home to it.
I still be friends with the Turkish people, because I know that they feel the same, they eat the same food, they enjoy the same jokes. at the same time, it's like you're having main course and you want a side dish. And side dish would be other cultures. And you mix it up and you like the taste.
Cultures have grown apart in many ways over the millennia. Not just in where we live, how we look, and what we eat, but what we say.
Kardeşim kim seyretti dünkü maçı?
Kim yaptı bu kısırı?
Today people speak more than 5,000 languages around the world. Some 150 of them right here in Queens. Many of those at PS 122 Elementary School.
Coreano. Me llamo Cristos, soy lituano.
Me llamo Ilias, soy francés y de Algeria.
Me llamo Abir, soy bengali. Me llamo Daniela y soy colombiana.
They're from all over. I have Greeks in here. I have people from Bangladesh, India, the Orient, South America. Most of them speak a foreign language at home. ¿Qué tiempo hace?
6th grade language teacher, Giovanna Saracini, speaks 3 languages herself.
No. Okay.
She's Italian by birth, but she'll soon learn she shares the same end marker as Necla.
Yo soy
español. Yo soy, no italiano.
Yo soy inteligente.
It's wonderful to see these kids from such foreign background converse in a language that's not their own. It is. I don't think you can find anything that's nicer.
Buenos días, me llamo Mas. ¿Qué tal? Bien, gracias.
No one is exactly sure when and where we humans received our gift of gab. Most of us learn to speak from our parents, who learned from their parents, and so on down the line. Which is why people with similar DNA tend to speak similar languages.
Alto, alto. The ancient Click languages of the San and the Hadzabe indicate humans may have used some basic form of language right from the get-go. But around 50,000 years ago, as Necla and Giovanna's ancestors were pushing north through the Green Sahara, many scientists believe people took a great leap forward. Stone and bone tools, art, and long-distance trade crop up in archaeological settlements all over Africa. And language may have made them all possible.
The ability to absorb this knowledge, to remember it, to pass it on orally. Truly modern speech, modern language might have appeared around that time.
One thing's for sure, about 50,000 years ago, a swath of vocal modern humans was chattering away in Africa and out.
44th Street and 30th Avenue, please.
Many of Giovanna's ancestors stayed put in the Middle East during this time, but many more, like the ones she shares with livery driver Sukhjinder Singh, would begin working their way east along an ancient superhighway of grasslands, which at the time extended well into Asia.
This is my house. I live here. This is one of my house.
Sukhjinder's Y chromosome markers indicate that his ancestors took the M9 out of the Middle East, made it as far as the Himalayas, then turned south on the M20. Despite earlier groups of people who were already living there, they'd established the first major settlement in India about 35,000 years ago.
Before my fathers, like my grandfathers, like before his fathers, like long time.
You wouldn't know by looking at him. But at least some of 27-year-old Dave Reed's ancestors were on this same eastern trek as Sukjinjus. Before reaching India, though, men in his line splintered off and headed north on the M45 to the mountains of Central Asia. It may not seem a safe haven for any creature, let alone human beings. But when Dave's ancestors made it to these icy valleys by around 40,000 years ago, this was an oasis. He doesn't know it yet, but Dave Reed, budding fashion model, actor, artist, can trace some of his ancestry to the icy slopes of Central Asia, along with about 50% of all European men.
And you gotta stay in shape, and that's kind of like how I make my money, so just trying to get really cut and, stay slim.
Dave knew some of his grandparents and heard stories about his great-grandparents. But like so many African Americans, when it comes to tracing back much farther than that, he hit some roadblocks.
My grandmother said that a lot of my ancestors came from Ghana. Other than that, I really don't know much. When everyone came over as slaves, there's no documentation, and there's no way to really know your history past that point. That's what makes this really important for me, being African American.
The mountains of Central Asia are among the last places Dave expects that history to lead. But here in Tajikistan, and other remote countries in the region, Wells is finding that some of Dave's DNA, along with much of the rest of the world's, sprung from right here.
Central Asia is a fascinating part of the world. It really is kind of a melting pot. It's really the meeting point between East and West. You can really see this almost written in the faces of the people. They do seem to be very mixed, and in some cases it's very difficult to say, well, this person looks East Asian or this person looks European. They're a combination of all of that and more.
If we look back about 40,000 years, we see the source of all these mixes were Dave's ancestors. When they first followed the grasslands to this region from the Middle East, climate was shifting between cold and relatively warmer periods. Through it all, these high mountain peaks provided a steady and vital resource: water. During good times, people could venture away from their stable water supply and onto the grasslands to hunt. During the bad, they'd retreat to their mountain base. For thousands of years, climate shifted from cold to warm and back again. Dave's ancestors responded.
They begin to find techniques for hunting these animals, projectiles instead of thrusting spears. Spears you can throw at these animals.
They stitched together clothing and built shelters. Quite literally, they toughened up.
They had a lot of things to adapt to. It was quite a harsh existence in some ways, very different from what they were used to in Africa. And so they developed cultural advances that allowed them to survive.
The changes were more than technological and cultural. They were physical. Under these harsh conditions, sunlight was hard to come by. Which means people were not only toughening up, they were lightening up as well.
Our African ancestors would have had relatively dark skin, Africa, lots of sunlight. It's a very tropical place. You need some way protecting your skin from the sun.
Dark skin acts as a natural sunblock in the tropics. But in the tundra of Central Asia, where sunlight is scarce, it's a liability. People need to let in all the sun they can to produce bone-building vitamin D.
As we moved into northern latitudes, and in particular probably into the region of Central Asia, we would have needed to lose some of that pigmentation, and so probably our skin started to become much lighter around that time, roughly 40,000 years ago.
Like all of our other physical differences, the genetic changes responsible for our varying shades of color are minuscule. Just a handful of mutations out of the more than 3 billion letters in the human genome form the foundation for humanity's entire notion of race. Tangible proof of something Dave and his girlfriend Michelle already know.
Race is just, it doesn't really mean much. I mean, people are different, but I don't base anything on a person's race.
For all the problems race has caused, our differences are literally not more than skin deep. Genetically speaking, race does not exist. Without those minuscule changes, though, people might never have survived in these northern latitudes. And that means we might never have carried on to populate the rest of the world. Around 35,000 years ago, an Ice Age-induced dry spell caused the Central Asian grasslands to radiate outwards. People tracked animals deeper into the ancient steppe lands and expanded further and further from their base. Some people would turn right towards East Asia and the Americas, and some, like Dave Reed's ancestors, would turn left and take the M173 towards Europe, leaving us with one obvious question. If Dave's markers trace back to this early European trek, why doesn't he look European? As far as he knows, Dave is African American through and through. When he gets his results, he'll learn that his Y chromosome, at least, isn't. Somewhere down the line, likely during slavery, one of his great-great-greats was a European who fathered children with a woman of African descent. Turns out this blurring of bloodlines wasn't uncommon. About 35% of African American men carry similar European lineages.
It doesn't, define him as a white person or a black person. These are genetic markers that simply tell us about part of your ancestry, so the rest of his genome might be completely African.
That European Y chromosome, in fact, makes up just a tiny fraction of Dave's ancestry, which we can see by tracing it back to its source.
Oh, yeah. One more lap. You can do it. Good.
If we rewind through all the people who've led to Dave since the slavery era, back 200 years, let's say, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, back about 10 generations, we find over 1,024 ancestors. A single one of them passed along Dave's Y chromosome link to Europe. The rest could well have been from Ghana, as Dave's grandmother told him, or Greece for all we know. However small his European link, though, it's enough to connect Dave Reed to George Delis, the quintessential Greek who's lived in New York almost all his life.
Hi, ladies. Hey. Hi, ladies. You better...
Recently retired, George was district manager for this immigrant neighborhood for more than 30 years.
See, now you had a Greek girl, you have a Dominican guy.
His constituents have converged here from all over the world, yet it seems there's hardly anyone George doesn't know.
How are you doing? What's happening? We're all immigrants. Who understands an immigrant better than an immigrant? Take myself, I'm an immigrant.
And like most immigrants, George works hard to keep his roots alive.
The first time I went to Greece in '79, my grandfather had passed away just before that. So I didn't get a chance to talk to him about his parents. But my father knew his parents, and he told me basically, they were farmers, and, she likes to rub on me, this woman, It excites her. I tell her I'm going to report it to her husband. That's as far back as I go. Well, my grandfather, my mother's father was a Cretan. He was from the island of Crete. And he was a very quiet guy. He was a baker.
If we look back with our DNA time machines, some 2,000 generations beyond these farmers and bakers, we see that around 35,000 years ago, George's ancient ancestors were among the very first to enter Europe.
I think that we're pure Europeans, that after Africa, my ancestors went up through the Middle East and settled in Europe. That's what I believe we'll find when I get my results.
George will soon discover that his ancestors didn't come up from the south, but from the east. Following the M173 along the ancient grasslands, which were then expanding across the Asian steppes. It turns out most European men descend from this same pioneering group.
They're the ancestors of George, my ancestors as well on my father's side. They would have been the first modern humans into Europe around 35,000 years ago, and when they arrived, they weren't alone.
When modern humans first made their way onto the European scene, we had an entirely different species to contend with: Neanderthals.
Well, you're here in my humble abode. This is my world right here, my things that I love. I just want to show you, this is an ancient Greek amphora found off the island of Rhodes.
In his second floor study,
and I have it
scattered among his ancient Greek pottery, precious gemstones, and billion-year-old meteorites.
Just got this from eBay. I believe it to be authentic.
George, a closet archaeologist, happens to have some evidence of who these first Europeans were.
Okay, let me bring you way back now in time, and this is Neanderthal. Who were these people? I looked at this and I touched it and I felt it and I said, this guy was right-handed. Look at the way it fits. Perfect.
Neanderthals had set up shop in Europe as many as 300,000 years before George's ancestors arrived. They adapted to it and developed skills to thrive in it. But their world was changing.
Neanderthals were much more muscular than we were, hell of a lot uglier than we were.
Modern humans have long taken the rap for Neanderthals' downfall. But at Europe's southernmost tip, on the Rock of Gibraltar, archaeologists are finding a different story. Around 28,000 years ago, these caves may well have been where Neanderthals made their last stand. They also happen to be among the last spots in Europe reached by modern humans. To Gibraltar Museum Director Clive Finlayson, that's no coincidence.
So this is a very special place, almost a kind of Garden of Eden for the Neanderthal people. They know the landscape, they know what they're doing, and they're better at it than you are, because you're learning as you go along. So it is possible that the arrival of modern humans down here is late, because there's other people here who are not as stupid as we think and are actually keeping them out.
It turns out while ice covered much of the rest of Europe, driving Neanderthals elsewhere to extinction, warm Atlantic currents entering the Mediterranean kept this place livable.
The cave would have been a place of shelter. Come night time, if you've got a nice big cave like this, where you can put a fire in the entrance and sleep behind it, then you sleep comfortably and protected.
Recently, Finlayson's team has uncovered embers from some of these ancient fires, which indicate Gibraltar didn't stay in Neanderthal Eden forever. One fire was built by Neanderthals one night 28,000 years ago. The other by modern humans 4,000 years later.
This light brown level here going down represents the occupation of the cave by Neanderthals. You see bits of charcoal there from the spitting away from the barbecues that the Neanderthals were having. The darker line upwards, more recently, marks the presence of modern humans. Apart from anything else, what this shows here in this cave is that you cannot blame the modern humans for the extinction of the Neanderthals, because here at least they never saw each other, they never met.
For what did? Once again, we turn to climate. Tools here reveal Neanderthals were no less advanced than modern humans. But while they had developed things like thrusting spears for hunting game in a warm, wet Europe, we had already developed long-range projectiles on the frigid steppes of Central Asia. As George's ancestors followed that cold, dry climate into Europe, they had the edge.
The bottom line really is that it went down to chance, because had climate, instead of getting colder and more variable, got warmer, well, one idea is that perhaps, with the greatest respect, those of us talking today would be Neanderthals, discussing the extinction of the other guys.
Within a few thousand years or so of our arrival into Europe, Neanderthals went the way of the dodo, while climate, once again, allowed modern humans to thrive. And these new European immigrants would create things Neanderthals never did. Artwork that still evokes awe today. Fashion designer Alma Mujazinovich's ancestors may have been among those old world artists. Her mitochondrial U4 marker reveals her ancestors left the Middle East and arrived in Europe shortly after George's first encountered the Neanderthals, around 35,000 years ago, perhaps retreating from a series of droughts at the time. Alma's immediate family was forced from their homeland as well. They lived in Bosnia as far back as anyone can remember, until one day in November 1992, when war forced them out. They fled with these photographs and little else.
We packed up our stuff one morning and we just left. Our town was, ethnically cleansed, and unfortunately, a lot of concentration camps were set up there, and a lot of Bosnian Muslims were killed in those concentration camps. So my parents decided that we were going to try to immigrate to the United States because of, a better future, education, and, a better life.
Alma was 9 when her family fled Bosnia. She's as much American now as Bosnian, but she still clings tightly to her European past.
This is my grandma. This is me, my dad's mom, and my mom. So you can see all the woman power. I want to hold on to what I'm made of, and that's, I think, the most important thing to me.
She now has high hopes for what her genes can tell her about her ancient relationships.
When you find something out that, for example, you may be coming actually from the same ancestors, and you've been killing each other and hating each other because of certain differences, I'm hoping that it'll open people's eyes and that will make us more tolerant of each other.
Irish musician Eamon O'Toole is banking on his DNA test to alleviate tolerance issues as well. He and his Korean partner Hannah Choi have been together for nearly 4 years, but Hannah's family has prevented them from taking things any further.
It hasn't been the smoothest road with her family accepting me as being an outsider.
He's hoping his DNA will smooth things out.
Maybe our ancestors' paths crossed along the way somewhere. Who knows? I don't know if it'll get me very far, but I could use it, yeah.
Whatever their source of discontent, both Alma and Eamon may soon draw deep inspiration from their genetic results. They are both carrying on an artist tradition, begun by their ancestors in the caves of Europe tens of thousands of years ago. It so happens that some of the very markers that bind Europeans like George, Eamon, and Alma to these old world artists can also be found in a new world as well, in people like Michelle de Jesus. Her ancestors set foot in the Americas as early as 20,000 years ago, way before Columbus. Growing up a New Yorker with Puerto Rican roots caused a bit of an identity crisis for Michelle de Jesus and her sister Myrna.
I really want to try to go to PR for Christmas, surprise the folks. As a New Yorican, when we'd go to Puerto Rico in the summertime, my cousins would sometimes tease us. It was just kind of like, well, she's gringa. She's from over there.
A fourth grade teacher and part-time professor who teaches a course on diversity, Michelle embraces her heritage, and like so many others, wants to preserve it.
My great-grandfather was Puerto Rican, and his parents were Puerto Rican, and so on and so forth. So, as far as I know, we've always been Puerto Rican, and I feel connected to that. And when I look in the mirror, I see that, and I see my grandmother and my great-grandmother. It's something that I cherish, and it's something that I am very protective of.
Michelle, now in training for the New York Marathon, has much to cherish. Like many other Latin Americans, her ancestors were among the very first people to settle this continent, among the very first Americans. To understand how they got there, we have to rewind back 40,000 years to Central Asia, where Michelle's ancestors and those of Dave Reed were one and the same. While Dave's took the M173 west towards Europe, Michelle's mitochondrial B marker headed east. Over tens of thousands of years, B and other markers like A, C, D, X and Y chromosome M242 were the first to settle much of Eastern Asia. Our Thai chef Ringri's ancestors were among them. But about 20,000 years ago, some of these people began ranging farther than humans ever had before.
You start running and you think, oh, 3 miles is impossible, and then you do 3 miles easily, and then you do 6 miles, and 10, and 13, and you keep going and going, and it's really amazing how far you can push yourself.
We can't be sure what pushed Michelle's ancestors, migrating game or population pressures perhaps, but something compelled them to face some of the harshest conditions on Earth.
The driving pump there isn't cold, and it's at that moment that this population gets lucky. They didn't know that one day the climate was going to get them into the Americas, but that's what happened.
18,000 years ago, with the Ice Age at its most extreme, ice sheets several kilometers thick covered northern Eurasia and America. With water frozen at the poles, ocean levels dropped some 300 feet. People struggling to eke out a living in this harsh tundra could wander over land from Russia to the Americas and not even know it.
And so these people would have been migrating back and forth, living a life that was basically between two continents. At some point, a gap would have opened up in the ice sheets in North America, and it would have allowed a few of these people through into the Americas, including Michelle's ancestors.
Today, a hot debate in science is exactly when those ancestors crossed. For decades, the New World's earliest archaeological evidence, 13,500-year-old spear points, found first in Clovis, New Mexico, and later in George Dellis' study, suggests humans didn't cross the Bering Land Bridge until about 14,000 years ago, at the earliest.
There you go. Couple Clovis points. These are the people that are in dispute. When did they come to this continent? Are they here 14,000 years? Or are they here 40,000 years ago?
DNA, like Michelle's, may fill in some gaps. Her Native American markers are found throughout the Americas, but their beginnings date back to Asia around 18,000 years ago.
Originated in Asia and moved into the Americas after that, after 18,000 years ago. So we say, with our error bars, between 15 and 20,000 years ago, people made this migration.
That's at least 1,000 years before Clovis, a date the latest archaeological evidence is helping to confirm. At Paisley Cave in south-central Oregon, archaeologist Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon has discovered some rather unconventional human artifacts.
We were looking and hoping, of course, to find spear points, evidence of their technology. Instead, what we found was the perfect human signature.
It's called a coprolite, and it is exactly what it looks like. A fossilized poop sample left behind by our fellow man or woman about 14,400 years ago.
There are both plant materials as well as animal materials, but it's the DNA that we found and identified as human that ultimately identifies this particular specimen.
Jenkins and his team have read that DNA, and it turns out to match many Native American markers today, including that mitochondrial B marker, which is being carried around by Michelle De Jesus. Together with other artifacts like bone and animal remains, the Oregon findings indicate Michelle's ancestors were living a fruitful existence in the Americas, much earlier than Clovis points would have us believe. But if we look even further south, about as far south as we can go, we find we might have arrived even earlier. At a dig site in Monteverde, Chile, traces of seaweed stuck to the blades of stone tools suggest people were already living near the bottom of South America 14,000 years ago. The site, 35 miles east of the Pacific, reveals that early Americans exploited coastal resources, like seaweed, for food and medicine, fueling the argument that the route from Alaska into the Americas wasn't inland, but along the coast. Either way, Monteverde is widely accepted to be the oldest site in the entire New World. The finish line for the longest run people ever took. It indicates that Michelle's ancestors traveled more than 10,000 miles from the top of Alaska to the bottom of South America in as few as 1,500 years.
This was the end of the longest journey that humans have ever made, and it was an incredible journey.
Michelle's ancestors continued to move throughout the Americas, including to Caribbean islands like Puerto Rico. By 11,000 years ago, the Ice Age was well on its way to retreat. The landmass binding Russia and Alaska vanished into the sea. The first Americans would be cut off from the rest of humanity until Columbus. Since 1492, the people of Latin America have become a complex mix of Old and New World genes, just like the many Latinos who've immigrated to Queens. Jorge Gonzalez, for example, has similar markers to Michelle's on his mom's side, but his Y chromosome originates a continent away.
I've heard that I have a great-great-grandfather that came from France and migrated to Puerto Rico, and I heard that he married a local lady from the mountains.
In a single person, genes that have been separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles reunite in Jorge. And his newborn son is even more mixed. Remember Leo? His mom, Carrie Nicholson Gonzalez, took a very different route into Europe than his dad.
He's a product of two people looking for the same dreams, everything in common, and they happen to have a different genetic background, which probably is not as different as we think it is.
As the world grows increasingly smaller, babies like Leo are becoming the norm. Traits that formed over thousands of generations are being wiped clean in just a few. While cultural barriers continue to fall, biologically we now know these barriers never existed in the first place. As people from all different walks of life come together, it's more like one giant family reunion. We set out to show that on a single day, on a single street, we could retrace the ancient footsteps of everyone alive today. And on a fall day, just across from Manhattan, Carrie and Jorge, Netla and Mehmet, Dave, Alma, Eamon, George, Michelle, and more than 100 other New Yorkers gather to hear the results.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? Let's wave those flags.
The genographic team begins by separating the crowd into 5 groups, according to their most recent ancestors.
you are basically standing in the part of the world, if you imagine this is a world map, that your ancestors came from most recently.
Each group is given colored flags, and beginning with the very latest migrations, Wells marches them back through time.
So the first group we're going to start off with is all the way over there, the red flags. So these are descendants of the first inhabitants of the Americas, the Native Americans.
They learn how their ancestors left Asia over a frozen land bridge, foraged coastlines, and sprinted to the bottom of South America.
So you guys are the furthest point on the human journey.
We've always kind of speculated and we've kind of said, I wonder if there's a little Asian in there somewhere, and there is.
Now I'm going to switch all the way to the other extreme of the globe. This big group over here, the Europeans. Let's see those flags. Okay, so there are lots of Europeans.
Wells conveys to the European crowd how their tool-making, spear-throwing artistic ancestors ultimately won out over the Neanderthals.
Your ancestors were pretty amazing people too.
I realize I'm cousins with Gildo Spadoni. He's Croatian, and I've known him since he's a kid. And there was this black officer standing next to me, and he's supposed to be European. I said, "How did that happen?"
I'm questioning my own self. How is it possible? How is it possible? Because I thought you had to be straight up from Africa.
Dave Reed was wondering the same thing.
And I never thought that I'd be standing with the Europeans and not the African. It kind of breaks all the molds on race and what people think about where they come from, and I can't wait to bring it home to some of my parents.
The surprises keep coming when the red flags and blue flags converge in Central Asia.
You all share a genetic marker in common, a guy who was living in Central Asia around 40,000 years ago. So at that point, there were no Europeans, there were no Native Americans, there were Central Asians.
I thought it was cool how Jorge and I came together. Who knows, we have connected years and years and years ago. And we're meant to meet at this point.
Next up, it's the East and South Asians. One group expanded out of Central Asia to populate places like southern Siberia and China. And the other was the first to travel along the Indian and Pacific Oceans and reach Australia.
I know that I have a lot of cousins and family members everywhere around the world. You know, I was like, yo, my cousin.
Now, if we could ask everybody in Central Asia and everybody in East Asia to coalesce over here to the Middle East around 50,000 years ago or so.
Whether they journeyed down the Nile and across the Sinai or fished their way along the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle Eastern group discovers that by around 50,000 years ago, their ancestors were among the first to set foot on a new continent.
I'm speechless. I don't know what to say. It's just so... I have goosebumps.
Now down to two groups. The descendants of everyone who left Africa and those who never did. And then, about 60,000 years ago, two melt into one.
Welcome home, everybody.
We spent 3/4 of our history as a species living only in Africa. While only two major genetic lineages left the mother continent, many more never did. As a result, Africa remains the most genetically diverse spot on Earth, even more so than Queens.
And knowing I'm from the place where everything started, it's like, I get 2 points. We all come from the same place, and that's a lesson for us. So we're all related, even though we look so different.
Eamon Otuma and his partner Hannah made the event a family affair, with Eamon's son Dylan and Hannah's godson Shane.
If my parents see this, later on or whatever, it'd be nice for them to connect that what we do may be different or how we look like, but essentially we share the same DNA.
What is yours? Yours is a mess. Your people have no stability. We have problems.
Necla and Mehmet Demirci were expecting life-altering results, and Mehmet got some. Half the people who carry his marker are Ashkenazi Jews.
I found my old relatives.
Imagine that. I mean, he doesn't have anything with Jews.
No matter what we believe, where we're from, or how we look, we now know every single person on Earth shares deep connections to one another.
We're all very, very similar, no matter what we say or do, no matter what language we speak, we're all the same.
I think that all the issues that we create for ourselves, racism and differences in religions and skin tones and all that stuff shouldn't matter anymore because we're all from the same place. So it's almost like unbelievable that's, you almost feel closer somehow.
So I hope that it makes a difference, and I hope that people can take it for what it is, but I don't know if everyone's ready for that.
Here in Queens, at least, it seems people are ready.
We're one family, with all the problems involved in family relationships, but one big family.
If this experiment proves anything, our human family is much more connected than we think.